The senator from Idaho.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to join in the sentiments of my colleagues from Georgia and Colorado who have just spoken about the importance that we must place as a nation on implementing an effective and meaningful energy policy in this country as quickly as possible. The United States is far too dependent in our energy policy on petroleum. And we are far too dependent in terms of the petroleum which we utilize on foreign sources. We need to diversify our energy policy, and we need to do it quickly. And by that, what I mean is that while we are seeking to become less dependent on petroleum, we must aggressively develop and produce our own sources of petroleum to help stabilize and control the increasing spiraling costs of oil. We also need to look at alternative and renewable fuels. We need to strongly move into nuclear power. We need to work on conservation aggressively. It's estimated that as much as 30% of the world consumption of energy could be reduced through effective conservation measures. That is another huge source of energy simply by not consuming. And yet, as we have all these alternatives and options out there, we are faced today with a bill in the Senate and a process to handle this bill that severely limits our ability to evaluate and hopefully adopt meaningful alternatives and to establish a sensible, comprehensive national energy policy. The bill we have before us today has one item in it, and that is change or governance of the futures markets, often this called a speculation bill. And certainly, and I'll talk about it in a moment, certainly we can debate whether there is a need for increased regulatory support for evaluation and oversight and management of our futures markets. I believe there is room for that, though I believe the bill that's before us is not well written. But while we are doing so, we ought to also take this opportunity, and Americans should be glad that an energy issue is on the floor of the Senate. But we ought to take this opportunity with a bill on the floor of the Senate to look at the other ideas about how we should achieve energy independence. The circumstances we face now threaten not only our economic security, but our national security. And Americans should cry out for this Congress to take solid, comprehensive action now, not to simply face one issue that arguably is not even at the core of the need for the solutions. The Senate ought to work the way that it has worked in the past. Let me give you a couple of examples. On bill after bill after bill, the way this Senate has historically worked is that a bill is brought to the floor, amendments are filed, a robust debate is held on the amendments, votes are taken on many of the amendments, and at the end of the process, after the Senate has worked its will, the bill moves forward for final passage. In 2005, when we were considering energy policy, that's exactly what happened. In the Energy Policy Act of 2005, there were 235 amendments proposed to the bill. Of that 235 amendments, after the process worked its way, 57 were adopted. There were 19 roll call votes on amendments, and it took 10 days for the Senate to complete this action. Just last year, as the Senate considered the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007, again, we had 331 amendments filed, 49 of which were adopted. We had 16 roll call votes on amendments, and it took 15 days on the floor, but the Senate worked its will. And the ideas of Americans from all perspectives were able to be brought forward and debated on the floor of the Senate. Well, what are we faced with now, as gas prices are over $4 in this country? A bill that brings forth one solution, namely to regulate the futures market, and then offers one other vote to the Republicans as an alternative. That's a far cry from the robust, full debate on policy that this issue deserves in this Senate. Now, those who have brought forth the bill with regard to speculation argue that with a bill dealing with speculation alone could reduce the price of gasoline by 20 to 50%. The reality is the academics and the economists state that it's not speculation, instead it's supply and demand. Warren Buffett, for example, says it's not speculation, it is supply and demand. We don't have excess capacity in the world anymore, and that's what you're seeing in oil prices. Walter Lucan, the chairman of the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, the commission that monitors these issues, says we haven't evidence that speculators are broadly driving these prices. The International Energy Agency states there is little evidence that large investment flows into the futures markets are causing an imbalance between supply and demand, and therefore contributing to high oil prices. Blaming speculation is an easy solution which avoids taking the necessary steps to improve supply-side access and investment to implement new measures to improve energy efficiency. The chairman of the Fed, Ben Bernanke, says if financial speculation were pushing prices above the level consistent with the fundamentals of supply and demand, we would expect inventories of crude oil and petroleum products to increase as supply rose and demand fell. But in fact, available data on oil inventories shows notable declines over the past year. The point, Mr. President, is that the experts are making it clear to us that although we do need to aggressively improve the capacity of our country to conduct oversight and evaluation of our futures markets to be sure that manipulation is not occurring, that the current situation is most likely not being driven by that speculation. That's exactly what the President's Working Group said to us in the letter that was sent to Senator Chambliss today. And I'll quote that again. To date, the President's Working Group, which again is the Secretary of Treasury, the Chairman of the Federal Reserve System, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Commission Chairman, state that to date, the President's Working Group has not found evidence to suggest that high crude oil prices over the long term are a direct result of speculation or systematic market manipulation by traders. The fact is that supply in the world has leveled off and some fear will begin declining. And demand in the world has skyrocketed. And as a result, those who invest in the futures markets for oil are speculating that it's going to go up. And if we want to address the issue, we will address supply and demand issues. Now, those of us who want to see the United States more aggressively engage in its own production are often told, well, you know, there are already 68 million acres of federal land that are open for production. Let's just force those lands to be where we produce, and we won't then have to go look elsewhere. Well, the fallacy in that argument is that 85% of the lower 48 outer continental shelf and 83% of the onshore federal non-park, non-wilderness lands are off-limit for exploration and production. And of that 68 million acres that is talked about, not every acre that the United States puts up for exploration yields oil. In fact, the percentage for onshore leases is only about 10%. Actually ends up ultimately being productive for oil. If you go off into the offshore, the success rate is a little higher, about 33%. And the deep water offshore is at 20%. My point being that these acreages that are being talked about that have been leased for exploration and potential production are not all going to be producing oil. In fact, the large majority of them will not produce oil. And those that are capable of successfully being put into production are aggressively being pursued. In fact, the law today requires that if they are not pursued and put into production, then the leases are lost. And so for those who want to avoid the United States getting more aggressive for its own production, to say, well, we have 68 million acres, and so let's just go there, it misses the point. The point is that there is a tremendous amount of oil in the United States reserves that we could utilize to defend and protect the security of our economy and our nation. A couple of examples. 14 million barrels are available on the Atlantic and Pacific Outer Continental Shelf. What does that mean, 14 million barrels? That is more than all of the United States imports from the Persian Gulf countries for the last 15 years. If you look to the oil shale reserves, right now the United States has more than 3 times of the oil reserves than Saudi Arabia in our oil shale in the states of Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming. Huge amounts of reserves. When you look at the reserves that we have, it's about 1.8 trillion potential recoverable barrels of shale oil, which is equivalent to hundreds of years of supply of oil at current rates of consumption. Why should the United States continue to refuse to engage in production of our own supplies, when we can do so in ways that will protect and preserve the environment and will make it possible for us to be far less dependent on foreign sources of oil? Mr. President, I haven't got much more time, but I think it's important for us in the Senate to recognize that we truly face a crisis, and this issue should not be dealt with in a partisan manner. There are ideas across this chamber, from across this country, by many people that range from more production to oversight and regulation of investment markets, to conservation, to electric cars and other types of efficiencies, to a number of different ideas, many of which are very helpful and can be a part of the solution. Wind and solar and other alternative and renewable fuels need to be incentivized. But we will not get there if the debate is restricted, and if the people of this country are denied the opportunity for the United States Senate to engage in a robust effort to develop a comprehensive national energy policy. It's my sincere hope that as we move forward, we will be allowed to have an open amendment process where senators can vote their conscience on a broad array of solutions, and that we can then send a strong, powerful bill to the President